Hello, thank you. This is Dismantling the Cult of Confidence. So I chose this topic quite a while back, not really knowing where I would go with it. I, for a very long time, wanted to give a lecture on the application of probability theory to understanding problems in modern epistemology and discourse. However, when writing this talk, I found that I was in the rather unenvious position of having to speak both about statistics and epistemology, which I think are considered by most people to be two rather impenetrable subjects. I know most people who take a smattering of math come away from the subject with the understanding that while useful, statistics certainly isn't very elegant or beautiful. And I get the impression that people who are of more philosophical bent have the idea that epistemology, while practical, isn't exactly the sexiest discipline. But to take a step back, I think these topics are very important. Their connection to public discourse is critical and really quite under-discussed. So today I'm hoping that we might take another look at what these subjects offer to our public discourse and actually what they could bring to improving our knowledge about the universe. First, I need a disclaimer. Although I am a grad student who works in applied statistical modeling, I am not a statistician and I'm not a doctor of philosophy. I'm sure that any theoretical mathematician in the audience could easily put me in my place when it comes to the deep theory. Still, I'd like to believe that I have enough knowledge to provide some insight into how perspectives on probability and confidence have affected and in some ways harmed our public discourse. So, perhaps I can try to motivate the problem. I propose that we live in a perplexed age. This certainly doesn't mean that people are ignorant or even closed to new knowledge. In fact, we know more about the universe than we ever have. We have greater technical expertise than we have ever had. We have more opportunities for education than anybody in any previous era. But as our knowledge of natural science and technology have grown, our ability and willingness to engage with ideas outside of a narrow range of specifically tailored technical claims has been utterly shattered. Our discourse has shrunk, and now it's not uncommon to hear people express utter skepticism, not just about abstract metaphysical claims like what is truth, what is goodness, what is beauty, but about empirical assertions that are not immediately verifiable, such as, is the Earth warming due to CO2? Is the NSA spying on the American people? Again, I'm not here commenting on the truth of these claims, only that the modern world, for the most part, regards these difficult questions with an attitude not of disbelief, but of utter exhaustion. Moreover, we regard those who speak with authority on these topics with an enormous amount of suspicion and mistrust. This, of course, is not how things always were. There were times when educated people could be confident moralists and rational advocates for justice. We have examples like Thomas Paine, James Madison, and even Edmund Burke. But it seems times have changed. It's now hard to even imagine somebody like Benjamin Franklin, a skeptic and a thinker who is nonetheless a moralist and a passionate advocate who acted with conviction in eras of great controversy for his time. Instead, there is a lurking suspicion that in our modern age, we really only have two options open to us. One option is to be a frothing fundamentalist, blind to the manifest flaws of our worldview and immune to contrary evidence. The other option is to be a philosophical skeptic, too preoccupied with uncertainty to ever act with conviction. Subsequently, and very predictably, our discourse has contracted. We no longer trust institutions and the leaders we have tasked with running them. We don't trust public discourse. We don't even believe in rational discussion for the most part, because we don't believe the answers it provides are honest and in any ways truthful. Of course, I'm not the first person to point this out. Polls have been confirming for the last 20 years that public trust in leaders, institutions, and ideologies has been taking a nosedive. We as a society are becoming more jaded. We join fewer public organizations. We talk less to people who disagree with us. We even leave our houses less and less. And this seems indicative of our society's core perplexity. We don't want to engage. We have withdrawn within ourselves because we do not believe there's anything honest in the assertions about the world that are made with uncertainty. Of course, everyone has a theory about why this collapse occurred. One theory that is very common that I hear over and over again is that the collapse in societal, political, and cultural trust is a discrete manifestation of a series of betrayals by public, corporate, religious, and academic leaders. Of course, the examples are legion. The Second Iraq War, Enron, the financial crisis, numerous academic and religious worldviews that have been shown to be utterly fallacious. All of this has utterly affected our public perception of the reality and trustworthiness of public discourse. In fact, I'm fairly sure this view is very popular in the audience today, since it's very topical, and it also dovetails nicely with a radical or progressive worldview. And while I would certainly agree that these events over the last 20 years have been damaging to the modern psyche, I think we need to look a little bit deeper. Being a student of history, I know this isn't the first time the public has been betrayed. We've fought wars on false pretenses. We've had huge overturns in our perception of the universe. And we've had huge overturns in the market and in society and in religions before, but it's never really impacted our core ability to perceive and talk about uncertain truths the way it has in the modern world. I'm tempted to look a little bit deeper and ask a more fundamental question that comes before us. Now, this problem of betrayal of authority and uncertainty kind of came up in an anecdote years ago, and it demonstrates how, to my mind, the problem is not simply political. Now, my friend, this is a long-distance friend, she had a terrible autoimmune disease, very, very persistent, and since the disease was not decreasing in its severity or going away, her doctor made the very reasonable suggestion that she get tested for something that was really bad, namely lupus. Now, lupus is a terrible disease. It's nearly fatal, right? And it's something you never wish on anybody. So, sure enough, she goes in. She gets a test, a 99% confident test that will test her for lupus. She tests positive. The doctor says, I have a 99% confidence that you have lupus. Of course, she's distraught. She thinks she's going to die. She's almost there to ordering her casket when another friend of mine, a medical professional, comes to her and says, I don't think you actually have lupus. You need to get a second opinion. Sure enough, she goes to a different doctor, gets the exact same test, and tests negative. She doesn't actually have lupus. Now, of course, here's the problem. It has nothing to do with the confidence, right? The test was 99% confident. But why was my doctor friend so confident that she didn't actually have lupus? Well, it's a simple matter of statistics. Lupus is a very rare disease. Only 1 in a million people have it. But a 99% effective test has a failure of 1 in 100. That means there's going to be orders of magnitude more people who test false positives than people who test positive that actually have the disease. And so after receiving this test, a patient that tests positive is more likely not to have lupus even if he tests positive for the disease. Now, after being totally relieved by the prospect that she didn't have lupus, my friend felt utterly betrayed, especially after she heard that common sense statistical explanation. I mean, how could the doctor do this? How could the test manufacturer do this? Weren't they professionals? Didn't they understand statistics? How could we trust them? Was this fraud? Well, I don't think the question is that it was fraud. The answer is incentives. The test manufacturer, as well as the doctor, have incentives to provide answers with a high degree of confidence. Thus, in the face of a very hard question to answer, does the patient in front of me have lupus? They're tempted to do a little bit of a switcheroo and equivocate with a much easier question. What's the percentage failure of the given test? Very different questions resulting in very different conclusions. And I'm sure you can see the incentives. I'm not sure how they could possibly market a test if they had been honest. What are they going to say? Like, give this test to your patients, and if they test positive for lupus, they probably don't have lupus but are marginally more likely to have lupus. I mean, I wouldn't buy that, right? I don't think anybody would. But you see the problem here, right? The problem is the very desire to be confident created a scenario where a dishonest answer was all the more likely. Now, this is more than just a counterintuitive statistical example. It's a demonstration of a problem that occurs again and again when an authority attempts to answer a fundamentally uncertain question and arrive at a confident answer. The problem is that confidence can be manufactured by slightly changing acute parameters in terms of how we ask our questions. It is a common statistical hat trick where a different question is swapped out for an easier but ultimately useless alternative. It's terrible for the public, it's terrible for the questioner. It's disastrous for our public discourse. But it works because it allows an authority to appear decisive, always in the right. It allows the authority to appear confident. And so we have the famous quote, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. I'm sure everyone's heard that, and I love statistics. I think it's a rigorous science. It is a rigorous science. But looking at this, it does actually seem sort of appropriate. But the foundation of the lie isn't in the statistical science itself. The foundation of the lie is in our obsession with certainty. I would propose that this obsession with certainty is one of the major sources of perplexity and lack of trust in the modern age. Our inability to be honest and talk constructively about uncertainty, and our obsessions with assertions of confidence over the admission of constructive doubt drives us towards skepticism and mistrust when cool caution is actually needed. Thus, a vicious cycle is created. As distrust increases, so does the demand that every new claim be accompanied by assertions of confidence, which, as ever, drives the need to equivocate and deceive. Our perplexity is thus like a Chinese finger trap. Our very ardor to escape its confines gets us more enmeshed in the problem. We leave ourselves open to charlatans who are ever so willing to tweak the terms of the discourse in order to obtain the desired level of certainty and then sell it to us. It's not a coincidence, in my opinion, that they oftentimes say that con people are confidence men. And I feel like I understand the inclination. A lot of this obsession mirrors my own approaches with my desire to have a certain worldview and dealing with a universe that is in many ways very, very unknowable. It's tempting to pursue certainty. It's tempting to pursue confidence. We look at modern science and modern engineering, and we see incredible feats and incredibly consistent solutions. We wonder if there aren't similar results hiding behind all human endeavors, if but we had the right approach and the temerity to demand clear and assured answers. Now, in some cases, this is true. Physics has a sort of certainty to it. We can ask questions and get precise answers again and again and again. And I remember being fascinated with these results. Seeing the predicted effects return like prophecy in physics has this enchanting effect, and it seemed utterly logical to demand the same level of confidence in other areas of human knowledge. Of course, there is an epistemological approach that seems like it might be able to produce the desired level of confidence and certainty. This is a method broadly outlined by David Hume and later inspired an approach to experimental statistics that was common throughout much of the modern world. The epistemology simply rejects all answers in absence of an enormously high threshold of evidence. And at one point, I embraced this myself. First, one starts with minimal assumptions about the universe, and subsequently demands that any positive proposition meet some high standard of evidence to overturn those minimal assumptions. Since my initial assumptions about the universe are so bare bones, I could thus craft my beliefs so that I would be wrong about a minimal number of things. Thus, I was confident, or should I say, I was confident I wouldn't be proven wrong. And due to the logical foundations of my beliefs, they were very robust. But of course, there are very deep problems with this methodology, not the least of which is that so few actual positive statements can be made and answered in this way. I noticed this when I looked at other thinkers who took a similar approach. When confronted with necessary but fundamentally non-scientific questions, it seemed like most other skeptics simply balked and admitted their desired beliefs under a not-so-subtle process of equivocation. Others embraced a more honest nihilism and deep skepticism towards things that couldn't be asserted in a framework that might sustain certainty. But I think the final straw to this worldview came when I heard a statement made by a brilliant atheist and futurist who I heard in an online interview. And here I'm paraphrasing. But this man said, questions that are intractable with the tools of science aren't actually questions, because they cannot be validly given answers that are empirical in nature. Now, I think so much of what we truly believe is really revealed when we encounter the antithesis. And this statement not only succeeded in sort of killing my remaining deep, empirical skepticism, but also laid way to what I think is a core principle in how we should approach epistemology. Namely, that questions cannot be invalidated by our epistemological method's inability to answer them. The question precedes the tools used to answer it. Moreover, the fact that a question cannot be answered with a desired level of confidence does not exclude it from consideration. This is critical. Physical science has confidence because it narrowly tailors questions in order to feed the procedural apparatus of the science itself. What's a valid physical experiment? Well, it's something that can be observed, of course. If the question can't be observed within the parameters of available tools, then the question itself cannot be properly considered a physical question. And thus the confidence is assured by the nature of the question that can be brought to bear. But in the real world, we cannot control questions that are asked. And it is utter folly to try to do so, since the only way to achieve similar levels of confidence is to exclude certain questions from consideration, or to erect evidential barriers that are practically insurmountable. Now, I know it's fun to shout, "Not enough evidence," and bang the door in people's faces, but at the end of the day, this methodology doesn't do anything other than ensure a person that they're not wrong. It's not actually a way to provide real positive information or provide genuine answers, even uncertain answers to hard questions. In some sense, I think we've been dazzled by the certainty of certain applied sciences. We've had a taste of confidence, and it's tempting to believe that answers like this are readily available, and ones that don't meet our desire for certainty are somehow invalid to begin with. But this is entirely upside down. Because believe it or not, it is actually incredibly easy to construct systems of knowledge that do nothing but reinforce their own confidence without conferring any information about the question at hand. And I never really realized this until I went into machine learning and statistics and had to actually try and engineer systems of beliefs for computers to use. Now, there's a kind of word problem / story that a lot of professors used to demonstrate this concept to their students. It's kind of one of these paradoxes. It doesn't have a name. I call it the gold digger story. So this is the story. A woman who wants to marry a millionaire comes to a statistician one day, and she says, "I'm using OkCupid. I have the ambition to marry a person who makes more than $1 million, but guess what? OkCupid doesn't actually have earnings or bank account information on the actual profile. But of course, I know statistics. I know that we can infer from demographic information that is available what the person is likely to make based on the statistical reality of demographics. So I want you, statistician, or machine learning programmer, to make me a model that will feed in the profiles on OkCupid and then label them whether they're likely to be millionaires, yes, or whether they're unlikely to be millionaires, no, right? And then I'll be able to tell from my OkCupid profile who the men are I can pursue who make more than $1 million. Okay, simple enough. The professor says, let's do that, students. Here are some demographic information, for millions of people. You go and build me a statistical model that will feed in information that you can get from OkCupid, eye color, hobbies, and then it will predict whether they are likely to be a billionaire or not. And of course, students try all sorts of complicated regression models, all sorts of massively complex machine learning neural networks. Maybe if the person has blue eyes, they're more likely to be a millionaire. Maybe if they like yachting as a hobby, they're more likely to be a millionaire, right? That wouldn't actually be true. But at the end of the time, at the end of the 2 weeks, they come back with their projects, right? And they look at how accurate they are. How confident can you be that a prediction made by your system is actually not wrong, right? Okay, so people 50% right, 60%, 70%, 80% best, tops. It's a hard problem, right? It's a very hard problem. You don't have the information required. And then the professor says, you guys are terrible. I have a model that give you 99.9% certainty every single time. And it's way simpler than your models. In fact, it's so simple, it's only one word. And that word is no. Is this person a millionaire? No. Is this person a millionaire? No. No, 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 no. Across the board every single time. And of course, because only 1 out of every 1 million people is actually a millionaire, this system will be 99.99% accurate. But this model is entirely useless. It only reports no. Its only job is to sell its own confidence. If the woman actually bought this as her own tool, she would actually have no other information other than the assurance that the tool she just bought was very infrequently wrong. And so it's very easy to build systems only on the basis that they are not wrong and still be utterly incapable of answering fundamental questions that we need to have answered. And I think we see some of these things when we look at people's philosophies, when human interactions. We're always aware of these self-assured yet useless systems of knowledge. I'm sure everyone knows the hard skeptic or the solephist who thinks all life is unreal or doubts every proposition, right? And of course, no evidence can ever be brought to unsettle these views, and every question brought to him has a very, very simple answer that it's invalid. Under this system, all questions are very easy to answer with a high level of confidence, but somehow all answers are pointless. For instance, I could say my philosophy is to say maybe for every proposition you bring to me. And sure enough, I'm 100% confident that every proposition might be true, right? Because of course, might covers both options. It's either true or it's not. But of course, this approach confers zero information. It does not address useful questions. And that's important to understand. So, in this talk, I've proposed the following. Society has become obsessed with producing certainty and has subsequently fallen prey to two types: charlatans who use equivocation to assure us that uncertain propositions are in fact certain, and deep skeptics who obtain their certainty by urging us not to ask hard and scary questions that cannot be answered with the tools available. But these approaches are limiting, and they leave our discourse impoverished. To be clear, I think the only way forward is to be honest about the uncertainty we face when asking difficult questions. Then this is easier said than done, right? It's very scary to talk about uncertainty. First, being uncertain, it seems like we would never come to definitive conclusions. And in order for epistemology to be useful, it has to be something that we can act on. Second, we have to be able to communicate about what we believe in a systematic way and understand what other people believe in a systematic way. This is the basis of rational discourse. We also want to know when somebody who's promoting a view, whether they've come to that view honestly, by honest application of the tools they're given, or whether they're just lying and are themselves a charlatan. Now, it may be my own professional predilection here to think that we might actually borrow some insights from statistics. In particular, we might explore an application of an alternative conception of probability called Bayesian analysis and see how it actually bears on this question: how do we come up with a framework for dealing with uncertain questions? Now, I certainly don't have time to explain the mathematical nuances of Bayesian statistics in this brief lecture, but I'm going to give it a really, really terse explanation. So as opposed to the traditional perspective on probability, where all probabilities visualize frequencies of a set of infinitely repeatable independent experiments, Bayesians view probability fundamentally as a degree of belief in a proposition. Whereas the classical view, we start with some baseline null minimal hypothesis and attempt to displace that with a critical threshold of data. Under the Bayesian perspective, And an analyst will start with some basic positive belief about the universe, and then subsequently integrate modifications as they experience new observations and new data about the universe. Thus, this process creates an evolving chain of belief as evidence becomes available, and preconceptions are modified in light of that evidence. Now, the Bayesian method has been incredibly useful in technical applications where data is disorganized or very limited, because it integrates uncertainty and accommodates decision-making under conditions where no critical amount of information exists either way. It's very useful performing when you have a very limited amount of data. Now, I have to be absolutely clear. This perspective on probability has its detractors, and it's come under incredible criticism over the last 30 or 40 years. It is very controversial. And of course, one of the main and persistent objections to Bayesian views of statistics and epistemology and probability is that it is fundamentally subjective. Without controlling two priors, two analysts who see the exact same data could develop very different, but nonetheless valid conclusions about the universe. It is therefore very difficult for one analyst to look at the conclusion of another model and discard it as invalid, even if he knows all of the data that's gone into producing it. However, the framework does lead to a consensus eventually. As information accumulates, two divergent systems will eventually begin to resemble each other, and agreement will be reached. But we have to be willing to go that extra step. And the existence of a disagreement is not necessarily evidence for the fact that that has been done through fallacious or improper means. Now, while not as necessarily cut and dry as the classical approach, the system provides a very powerful map on how beliefs and ideas develop and evolve over time. Now, I think needless to say, I think there is a lot we can learn from this technical perspective as it applies to our own uncertain beliefs about the universe. Insofar as the philosophy of David Hume and the classical tool of hypothesis testing encouraged us to be rational and always look for sufficient evidence, we might take some key adages from the perspective of the Bayesian framework and use them to enrich our own perspectives on knowledge, certainty, and how to properly conduct public discourse. So to close, I have taken 4 key adages that are roughly based on rules of thumb statisticians use when applying their craft. And I speculate here how they might be actually transferable to our application of public knowledge and public discourse. I will provide the quotes when I actually can. First, number 1, to quote statistician John Tuckey, "It is always better to have an approximate answer to the right question than an exact answer to the wrong question." And as I'll reiterate, we can never choose our questions based on the competence of the available answers. Moreover, we must constantly be on the lookout for equivocation or misunderstandings that might make us feel like we've answered a question when we really haven't. This is a main source of chicanery in modern society, and I think our misunderstanding of confidence has really harmed our ability to notice and deal with this problem. Number 2, subjectivity of a methodology does not make it invalid or indicate that it does not necessarily result in objective truth. We have seen from Bayes that systems that perform in a subjective manner can eventually lead towards, or behave in a subjective manner, can eventually lead to an objective conclusion. They are still useful, despite the fact that you might not necessarily get consistent answers. We have to become, in light of this, increasingly comfortable with trying to find common ground among people who have radically different worldviews and radically different prior understandings of the universe. It is not always going to be the case that 2 honest investigators observing the same data will necessarily come to the same conclusion. The difference does not necessarily indicate a mistake or dishonesty, although both are possible. We must be cautious, slow to accuse people of fraud, and willing to go the extra mile that may be needed before we can get to a reasonable agreement. Number 3, we have to be comfortable with making decisions under uncertainty. Most important questions in the world cannot be answered with the kind of confidence that we might expect from other physical sciences. But this cannot hold us back from grappling with the very real problems of our modern society. Decisions aren't made when we have confidence in the answers. They are made when we need to make them. And I think we need, as a society, to come to terms with the fundamental epistemological humility in order for us to make decisions and understand weighing decisions when there's uncertainty all around. And finally, and I think this might be the most important quote I've ever encountered in any field, by the famous statistician George Box, we must remember this: all models are false, only some models are useful. Many of the great errors in history have come due to an overcommitment to models that are too simple or too small to account for the nuances of the complex reality we occupy. From phrenology to eugenics to creationism, we always have to be skeptical of the tools used to make decisions, even if they are the best we have that are available. More fundamentally, if we become too wed to models that are restrictive, they may close us off from more fundamental questions that are outside their scope. We may, in a sense, become trapped by the very models we sought to enlighten us about the universe. It's always tempting to see a model of the universe and confuse it with reality, but I am convinced that no model will ever be sufficient to answer all human questions. Even the Holy Grail, the unified physical field theory, doesn't seem to answer many of the myriad questions that we could have as sentient beings. For instance, if I showed you a set of theories that completely described all physical reality and all observable physical phenomenon, would that in essence end your capacity for questioning? I would say no. And if we have questions that a given model can't answer, that is all the more reason to look elsewhere for new sources of knowledge, however uncertain they might be. Now, these bullets are a little bit terse, and I certainly don't think that they're everything we need to sort of break the perplexity and the uncertainty and the lack of trust we have in the modern world. But I do believe these insights can provide at least a little bit of a start. They are at least a way of moving the discourse forward. If we are to grow as thinkers and as moral individuals, we need more conversations where we discuss contentious issues under uncertainty and less reasons to discard arguments and questions out of hand. We should not be afraid of compromising our goals and principles when we admit to uncertainty about our models and our ideas of the universe. If I may close with one note, it is this piece of assurance. There is a space in the modern world between the fundamentalist and the skeptic. There is a space in this modern world between the sophist and the charlatan. Confident and honest approaches to belief are available to us if we are honest about how we arrived at our conclusions and how the doubt we still have has come to be. It may be incredibly difficult to answer some questions, but we must love the truth enough in order to risk being wrong in order to pursue them. We may not be able to entirely rid ourselves of doubt, but this is a small price to pay in order to grapple with the truly important questions that make us human. Thank you. Question?
Well, you said your statistics, and yet you made a statement that seems to be non-statistical.
Mm-hmm.
You said there's a dichotomy, but the dichotomy would be the extreme of the statistic and not the majority. So, because you said that it's either
what's it in particular?
Fundamentalist belief or that you have doubt. You said it's either sophistry or it. You seem saying.
No. I think you misinterpreted. I was actually urging the opposite.
Oh, I'm saying it seems like it's your whole platform is an extreme or not extreme.
No, I'm saying that's what I'm trying to dismantle. I'm trying to dismantle the idea that we either have to be blind to evidence or we have to be like, oh, anything can be true.
But did you not say that we are doing that?
That's
only are two extremes.
Well, I mean, people do that. It's not right.
No, do they? What statistic is that? Really, you're saying to.
Okay, I don't know. Maybe.
right? You're saying the two extremes.
I know people who do it.
But knowing people that do it doesn't equal every people.
Oh, so you want.
The other thing I would say too is you made a couple statements. You made a statement also that Benjamin Franklin wasn't judged. Yes, he was. He was very judged. It would seem as you're using.
Oh, wait, what was the statement?
It would seem you're using goggles of history to look back.
No, I'm saying Benjamin Franklin was someone who acted in controversies of his age, even though he was an intellectual that grasped the uncertainty of the propositions.
But you said that he was trusted. He wasn't trusted. He was challenged all the time.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm actually, in that sense, I was trying to refer that the trust Benjamin Franklin had that allowed him to.
It's different than now.
Oh yeah, certainly. I can't think of an equivalent figure.
I would say here's the flaw in that right there, because back then only white rich men of status really got to talk, and now we have women and minorities. So.
I don't think that's the source of this perplexity.
You don't? You think that when you can limit the ideas to only a certain kind of people, and you don't have to think about women, you don't have to think about blacks and slavery, you can come up with ideas because you have similar goals.
There is some truth there, in the sense that I think we have a harder. Like you're asking me to approximate how much?
How much do you think truth?
And what are you asking me, like, for a Bayesian degree of belief measurement?
How much truth? You said it had some truth. What percentage? 10%?
I don't know how you measure truth. What units do you measure truth
how
in?
Do you? Well, if you don't know how to measure truth, then how do you?
Well, I know how to measure degree of belief.
Okay, how do you measure degree of belief? Your belief.
Degree of belief is measured from a 0 to 1 scale, typically with 1 being absolute certainty and 0 being utter deniability. And this is how we typically do it in Bayesian statistics. And this is very controversial, like I said.
Your belief, because you made the belief. I'm just asking your belief. What a percentage do you believe? You said it was somewhat true.
I have probably about an 80% opinion that, I'd say like 99% that that's in part true. I'd say that that's a major effect. I'd probably have 50-50 on it. I'm not convinced that the difference in ethnic groups that have voices in our contemporary society is what's really contributing to the fact that we have less trust in our leaders. I think it has more to do with the amount of information we have to process. But I agree, we do live in a much more multicultural society, and because of that, we're incorporating people that have worldviews that are very, very different and have much more divergent, as Bayesians would say, much more divergent priors to understanding the universe. And that causes a little bit of a problem too.
The other thing I want to say is you say certainty in epistemology, and epistemology doesn't have a one blanket, all certainty, no certainty.
Yeah.
There's psychological certainty, epistemic certainty, and there's incredulity, there's epistemic closure of beliefs. Mm-hmm. So it's not one thing, it's multiple things that people either do because they have more justification or because they have just with psychological belief, just a belief that something's true.
Of course. I'm not here giving an outline of epistemology. My only attempt right now is to outline what I think is a common mistake that people make, either by becoming too skeptical or relying on equivocation and false assurances, when they really should just be honest and have a looser epistemology. And so I'm not saying that I've completely outlined all epistemologies or all groups. I'm just saying this is a common epistemological mistake. It's similar to mistakes made.
Mistake. What I'm saying is, if you say that something's wrong, how do you know it's wrong? What method are you using to validate what you're saying is wrong?
Okay, here's that's actually a good question. I would say there is some ways to. So I would say if you have a belief that something is like 99% likely to happen, and you keep on getting failures on that belief, then that's a failure of an epistemological system.
Something's reliable. The process can be followed through multiple times and show us.
The problem with reliabilism is it kind of presupposes that opposite view of statistics that I mentioned that contrasts Bayesianism, called frequentism. So I'd have to be careful about how I use that word. But in essence, yes, if I saw something that gave me 90% odds and it kept on failing, or it didn't answer the question that I initially set out to ask, then I would be very suspicious of that system.
So the problem also could be the question, right? If we've asked the wrong question, we may actually get a wrong answer.
And that's critical. Question?
Yeah, I don't know, this might be off the track. Someone brought up a week ago, Nick Bostrom.
Mm-hmm.
He's pretty heavy on statistics, and I'm kind of curious.
Mm-hmm. I'm not a statistician, I'm sure he can. If he's a theory guy, then. What?
Are you familiar with him?
No. I mean, is he a pure mathematician?
The other question is, I mean, you brought up this idea of constructive doubt.
Yes.
Do you think you're putting forward a thesis that's anti-realist? Or do you think that is that we can't really know stuff, it's nothing but models? Or do you think we can really know what's there?
I mean, I guess I'm putting forward something that favors favors acting on uncertain conclusions. In that sense, it's not realist. In the sense, it's also, if we were to, maybe I'm writing this Bayesian analogy a little bit too hard, and it's very easy to overuse scientific analogies, and when you apply them to philosophy, there's always things that don't really cross over. I mean, I would say I'm fundamentally skeptical. I mean, I'm convinced that there is truth. I'm just not so sure that there's going to be one model. What?
Not so sure what it is.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm just not convinced. I'm not convinced that there's any model that's really going to capture that truth. There's a difference between.
There's the model thing.
Well, but I mean, so.
On models.
Okay, I guess if you want me to admit my own flaws or own outlines, I just say you're absolutely right. I do see every system that we take through the universe as being a proposed model, and I interrogate it as if it were a model, right? And that's because I do have a fundamental belief that the truth of reality is beyond humans' capacity to model it, and so any model we put over it is naturally going to have areas that don't quite match up. And you're right, that is an assumption that I'm making, and you're welcome not to share in that, but that is the approach I take to examining the world. Yes?
So speaking about epistemology and uncertainty, I mean, I have a master's degree in what I've seen in the academia. You can let me know if you see the same thing, is that there is a lot of postmodernism, meaning that there is just no truth.
Yes, that's common.
Which is like, there is just perception. You can't really know reality. There is no objective reality. There is just perception. I'm not saying I don't agree with that, but that's the big thing. Have you seen that?
Oh yeah. It's everywhere. That's part of sort of the fundamental confusion. We look at people who try to answer deep and tough questions as if they're sort of asserting power over us. Like, that's kind of funny, right? Like, you oftentimes hear discourses in terms of power, like with this postmodern thing you're mentioning. Like,
Right.
And that's part of the sort of perplexity we have with answering hard questions.
Well, would you say that there is objective truth?
Oh yeah, I think there's objective truth. I think there's a truth that we can all access.
Right. Oh, I see. So you're just saying that a lot of models, they're kind of just irrelevant. They'll give you kind of like
They're very limited, yes.
very limited, or maybe they're just misguided, in that they'll give you like a reliable answer, but it just doesn't have anything to do with what we want to know.
Exactly, right? You can create a model that is incredibly confident and validates its own confidence, but at the same time does not answer the question that you want it to answer. And these models are sort of dangerous because they can sort of feel very, very comfortable when you're using them.
Could you actually I wanted to ask you as well, just
Sure.
could you make an example of such
Like a philosophical model?
No, real.
Oh, a great example. Okay, so like the financial crisis, right? You remember that? So like all of these companies were designing portfolios that were based on ridiculous models about how assets changed in value. Namely, they believed that assets were sort of these independent entities, and they were using this normalized model of loss and this normalized model of risk that assumed that things had very, very controllable tail effects. And this model sort of reinforced itself because as long as you were in the period of regularity, it validated itself with incredible frequency, right? It was right every time until it was suddenly wrong, right? There's this guy, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He's a mathematician who worked in the financial industry, and he realized this, and he said the whole financial industry in this country was, and might still be, it was totally predicated on the turkey principle, right? Like the turkey, every day up until November 26th, the Thursday of Thanksgiving, the turkey sees the human and expects the human to give him food, right? And because of this model, he has this great model, human always equals food, and it's consistent again and again and again until it's suddenly not consistent, right? And that's the thing, right? These models were being built to evaluate risk. They were being built to model the deviation from the regular behavior. But instead they were being built essentially to be confirmed by regular behavior, right? The incentive was to have them being validated under ordinary operating conditions, when you really wanted to have them evaluated under sort of extraordinary operating conditions, right? And so the model worked well to sell itself, and it also worked well to sell itself to people who want to make a lot of money off of it, without actually doing what it wanted to do.
Yeah, it sounds like it can be just an instrument of fraud of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, it's always so hard to diagnose fraud because we have this sort of confirmation bias. But yeah, a lot of people use you'll ask one question that's very hard, and then you'll get an answer to a different question that's very, very easy, that sounds like your first question.
It's like a straw man.
Yeah, it's sort of like a straw. I think it's more what I think philosophers would call this equivocation, or if you're more like slang philosopher, you call it like weasel words, right? You make a statement in vague terms that is halfway between a proposition that is very confident and one that's very unconfident. And the unconfident proposition is the one that actually contains the interesting result. And the confident proposition is this there for safety. So if you're challenged, you can retreat to your confident proposition that's not very useful.
So we're talking about political rhetoric.
Yeah, you can see the examples just spring to mind, right? It's common, right? It's common, and it's because we can't admit that we're uncertain about how the universe actually works. I think that's something we need to get over as a society, or at least come with more constructive tools to actually address it.
What do we get by overcoming our uncertainty and being bold versus being in our postmodern bath form, bath of doubt? What do we get?
We get the ability to actually find true statements, right? Even if they're highly uncertain or highly rare. It's like in the example with the gold diggers paradox, right? I mean, what does the woman get for using this model of identifying millionaires that is only 50% accurate, right? Well, I mean, she's going to get a lot of wrong answers, but if her goal is to actually, is her goal to actually find the true husband that she wants, or is her goal not to be wrong? If your only goal is to not be wrong about the universe, I mean, you can adopt all sorts of worldviews that will just be like, maybe, and you're never wrong with maybe, right? But I think that people actually want to come to beliefs, and more particularly actions based on beliefs, that are directed with some sort of truth, even if that truth is really hard to obtain.
At least you would hope people.
Yeah, it's scary, right? Because I'm sort of saying we have to maintain skepticism, maintain our ability to question, but only in a very light way, and we have to essentially sort of maintain our fanaticism, but only in a very light way as well, right? We have to be willing to act, but at the same time cautious that we could be wrong.
Well,
sure.
So what do you do with people who want to know what degree of certainty something has?
Oh, that's hard. I mean, so you had to be very specific, right? So a frequentist would answer a question about what degree a certainty something has as how many times has this occurred, and how many times has it happened in the past, right? So a classic example was people were trying, but that's not always the right way to look at things, right? For instance, Boeing in the 1950s, it tried to determine through statistics what the likelihood of a quadruple engine failure would happen on one of their B-52 bombers, right? And of course, it's never happened before, so the probability is 0? Like, no, right? Like, events that never happen have to have some positive probability. And so, but when you start doing that, you have to enter into this more loose subjectivity of the Bayesian perspective, where we have some understanding of the universe and we're really just updating that with data, rather than working from some baseline, no knowledge, and then reconstruct it completely from past events. So we have to be very particular about what question's being asked and what tools we have available to understand it. If someone was to ask me, like, what's the force of gravity on Earth, I believe I would be able to answer that with high confidence, because I can do experiments, we have myriad observations, and it's very measurable. If someone were to ask me something about, like, I don't know, even, what's the probability that sea levels are going to rise 15 feet in the next 200 years, that proposition is much less certain, right? We'd have to incorporate some kind of probability that that's going to occur.
But can Bayesian theory quantify certain?
Oh, it can, yes. So to give you an example, the instance I started with, the lupus example, where the woman was given a 99% effective lupus test and was subsequently positively diagnosed, even though, because it's 99% and lupus is so rare, there's going to be more false positives than there are actual cases. That's easily solved with Bayesianism, right? Because what you do is you assign a prior probability to the woman having lupus, which is very, very low. So when the 99% test comes in, it doesn't fully supplant that prior knowledge, it just updates it, right? But then, of course, the question is, where does the prior come from? And therein lies the great criticism of Bayesian perspectives, right? Because that's subjective. And there are people who claim that they can make Bayes objective. They're called objective Bayesians. But this is even more controversial. When I was my first stats class at UW, the professor came into class and he had this huge T-shirt that was this objective Bayesianism with this huge cross mark through it. And he's like, if you get through this class and you believe you could be an objective Bayesian, I have failed as a professor. Okay, well, this is very controversial. But yeah, so incorporating some prior belief is quantifiable. But the problem is that your prior belief is not necessarily, you can't come to people's prior beliefs and say, well, that one's right and that one's wrong. I mean, you can construct rules that are kind of like rules of thumb, but you can't definitively say that that person's prior is better, because it's not really based on evidence. And so two observers, while they experience evidence they're likely to converge, they're not going to get to the same results. They're going to be going on these paths that we hope at some point meet in the future, but there's no guarantee. And
Because they're updating their priors.
Exactly, right? They're updating their priors with the same information, so there's likely to be a convergence effect, right? But there also might be disparate information that could lead to some divergence. And we have to just sort of hope that agreement is in the cards for us. And in most cases, Bayesian learners do come to agreement after a certain amount of information. I know there's a time limit. Can we still answer questions? Okay, sure.
You were talking about the frequentists?
Frequentists, yeah.
Using past frequencies? Isn't that
Well, I don't want to.
Bayesian prior?
Every problem in statistics can be phrased both as a frequentist problem and as a Bayesian problem. So problems aren't necessarily, you can do hypothesis testing with Bayesianism, you can do it with frequentism. They're just a different philosophical outlook. Neither of them is right. They have flaws and they have blind spots. And the thing with Bayesianism is that it's oftentimes a better way of examining systems where you have a very low amount of information, right? And so that's why they're, in some sense, preferable. And there's some abstract problems that they actually do better on than frequentist models, and I'm probably not qualified to answer that with specifics. Yeah, you shouldn't think that problems are by their nature Bayesian or frequentist. You can use either framework of describing anything.
David, I know you're a medical.
I do some research in, I do math statistics models for medical applications, yes.
So why didn't that doctor, your friend's doctor, just do 2 tests? Why did they put it all on the one test who came up with a false positive?
Well, are you talking about the doctor who gave her the initial?
Yes.
Well, okay, because I think the doctor was probably misinformed what this test was and didn't quite understand the statistical implications of it. I mean, a lot of these things is like, okay, you're having a long day, and there is, you can always get around these problems, right? I mean, obviously, he could give her 2 tests, and that would effectively solve the problem, right? You can always get around. You can always get around these problems with enough attention to detail. But I think the problem was just the sociological setup to begin with, right? There was an incentive to market this test as highly confident, and there was an incentive by the doctor to use this test as a confident prognostic for whether this person was sick or not. Of course they could have done it better, right? Like,
Not a good.
oh no, I mean it's, I mean sometimes it kind of like it's tempting not to get up here and just go over like stupid statistical mistakes of the 20th century. You could I mean, and you do that and people look like idiots, right? But I mean, in some sense, I'm not. It's very understandable, right? Because you want to have confidence in something, and there's sort of a willingness to believe that the model you have in front of you is the right model. I forget which statistician, I was looking at my big notebook of statistical quotes, and there is this, I forget whether it was Box or one of the other statisticians that I quoted today, but he said that mathematicians are a lot like fashion photographers. They always have this tendency to fall in love with their models, right? And that's the thing, right? Like you see this 99% effective lupus cure, and it looks so tempting. Right? Just grab it off the shelf, right? There's probably consequences, but it's right there, So I think it's just human weakness when it comes to a lot of things like that. Any other questions? Great, I think we're good. Thanks a lot.